Getting freaky on a Friday night, yeah.
Welcome, dear viewer. This is Derpy. I know that Elden Ring finally exists, and I could not be happier, believe me. But even with the release being so close, I still wanted to make a final build video on Dark Souls 3, or at least one of my last for it. Anyway, all 12 of you still playing Dark Souls 3 and wanting to try something a little bit different, we're going to be talking about a build that, to my knowledge, doesn't have a guide or a video on it specifically in depth, and that would be the Jack of all trades build, the Raw build. There's good reason when you take into consideration that its main appeal is for early game progression and leveling, with raw gems being relatively available in the early game. Raw gems increase the base damage of a weapon by a decent amount, and completely takes away the scaling of a weapon. Of note is that upgrading a weapon level increases the base damage and the scaling of a weapon, which is why Raw is not seen in higher soul level brackets due to the loss of AR if infused Raw. Majority of weapons rely on scaling to gain additional damage and can determine mediocre or good AR on weapons on a specific build. This means that instead of leveling the typical stats, such as strength or dex, to gain additional damage on our weapons, we're just going to meet the requirements for our weapons that we're going to be using, which I'll get back to in a moment. First, I recommend Knight as your starter class for the better stat alignment for raw builds and the attunement slot we get, which will be important later. Second, we're going to farm for raw gems, which we can do very early in the game at High Wall of Lothric, specifically the Tower on the Wall bonfire, where we go down and defeat hollows where we can acquire the raw gems. We don't need any coals, thankfully, like many other infusions, so we can just upgrade right out of the gate.
Come here! It's cold and raw! I'm done. I'm fucking done.
Now that we got our gems, what about the weapons? Well, I recommend having the following stats in strength and dex, which is 19 and 16 respectively, so we can wield quite an array of weapons. Some outlier weapons that I want to mention, which majority of us already know, I'm sure, but just in case, the Dragon Slayer Axe is arguably the best raw infused weapon, just for its sheer damage output when buffed with lightning pine resin or lightning bundles. The only downside is the simplistic, slower moveset of an axe, but having an offhand rapier can offset the slow swings and can combo into the axe's R1s. Another weapon that performs well while raw infused is the Drakeblood Greatsword, which has some downsides such as the range and 3 split damage types, but the low weight for a Greatsword, unique two-handed R1s, hyper armor, and absurd damage output when buffed with lightning definitely deserves a spot in a raw build. The Rangru Curse Sword also deserves a mention for the speed, innate poison, and raw damage output that it has. Just an overall good addition to have when having to be a bit more serious against an evasive opponent. For a heavy weapon, I would honest to goodness recommend using the Grey Wooden Hammer, and if you think I'm joking, I'm not. Of course it's a great hammer and comes with its cons, but it has the Spin Bash weapon art, which enables the R1 weapon art into R1 true combo, has the least stamina usage in its class, and it's the lightest to boot. Pair that with the hand axe and you got a rather good setup that some opponents just don't know how to fight. Last weapon I want to throw in is actually the pike, since you don't usually see it, but with these stats you can wield it. Good R2s and decent R1s, nothing special, but it's nice to use. Other honorable mentions involve the mace, reinforced club, falchion, and the sellsword twin blades for their outlier damage when raw infused. Side note, pick yourself up a crossbow like the light, heavy, or arbalist, since they have low stat requirements, no scaling, which is great for a raw build, and having ranged options against an opponent casting spells or just in general is a good idea. For great bows, I would absolutely recommend using the Millwood great bow. Even if it says you can't wield it, if you two-hand, you can, since whenever you two-hand a weapon, you gain a 1.5 multiplier, which lets you use the 28 strength requirement great bow. This also applies to the winged twin axes, which can be invaluable as a burst damage option.
Chef, let me ask you, is that raw?
Chef, it's under. I have another one. I'll give it to you right
Hey,
now.
come here, you. Answer my fucking question.
I want to briefly mention some of the builds that I currently have, which I will display on the screen right now. Of course, you can choose your armor and your fashion if you want better absorption and optimization. Typical ring setup involves the Ring of Favor +3 and Prisoner's Chain with your choice for the other 2 slots. Here's where I would say makes a raw build stat-wise. With the extra levels you have, level endurance to where you feel personally comfortable, and put the rest into vigor or vit if you feel like it. But before that, I want to recommend actually leveling your intelligence and faith to 10 and 13 respectively, which I'll get back to in just a moment. Put the rest into vigor and vitality, and you have hefty HP and vitality to wear heavy armor and your weapons. Now remember the knight, hunter, scholar, and priestess rings and how they can increase strength, dex, intelligence, and faith by 5 levels? Well, we're about to enable our raw build to be able to do more than a typical physical build can usually do at lower soul levels. Starting with the knight ring, this allows us to use weapons that we normally couldn't use unless two-handed, such as the Exile Greatsword, Lothric Knight Greatsword, Great Machete, Gargoyle Flamehammer, etc. If you want sheer ultra weapon damage, these weapons allow for just that. Pairing them with a straight sword, hand axe, or rapier can really make these weapons shine. My favorite being the Great Machete for 1v1 situations, since the rapier can combo into a Great Machete R1. The quickness and hyper armor of the setup just makes it very appealing to me, and it might just for you too. The Hunter Ring lets us use the Farron Greatsword, Goddards, Grave Wardens, Twin Spears, Dancers, Pontiff Scythe, and even the Pontiff Knight Curved Sword if you're into that kind of thing. The Scholar Ring enables us to use some basic sorceries of note like Frozen Weapon, which could help in some scenarios like on the Twin Blades for burst damage. As for weapons, you could use Freed's Great Scythe, the Storyteller's Staff for the weapon art Poison Cloud. But the main weapon I want to emphasize is the Great Sword of Judgment, because when the weapon is buffed from the weapon art, this Great Sword can hit like a truck. Even if you don't like the two-handed R2s on it, if you land a fully charged two-handed R2, it can combo into a follow-up R2, causing a ton of burst damage. Definitely would recommend for tougher ganks. For arguably the best ring on this build, the Priestess Ring enables some survivability tools and miracles such as mid-heal, replenishment, Filianor's Chime, Sunlight Straight Sword, and other chimes for their weapon art. I personally run replenishment with Filianor's Chime, as the total FP cost for HP healed is really good, coming at 535 HP recovered over the duration of 60 seconds. Pair that up with Sun Princess Ring during that time, and you can recover upwards to 655 HP, which is more than a plus 10 Estus Flask if you're willing to wait. This is mainly for campers or gankers though. Also, if you want to save on FP, I'd recommend also quick swapping to the Farron Ring on another ring slot for the weapon art on Filianor's Chime, and then swapping to the Dusk Ring for replenishment. Remember that all of these rings should only really be used in the moment that you need them. Don't just leave them equipped. For weapons, you can use the Crucifix of the Mad King, which is really strong when buffed with Dark Pine Resin. The unique moveset and damage can definitely catch a lot of players off guard, and don't go forgetting about its Greatsword Poise health either.
It's fucking raw. I'm struggling. The fish is fucking raw. It's the second time.
Some miscellaneous things I want to discuss. For one, you could use deep and fire gems, which works similarly to raw gems in that they take away all scaling, but they lower base damage and add dark or fire AR, which can on some weapons cause them to do innately higher damage. Like off the top of my head, the longsword and regular scythe can deal more damage consistently, and usually more than they would raw infused, but you wouldn't be able to buff them, which is why I wouldn't really recommend using them that way, unless you feel like it's worth it. Speaking of buffs, use them whenever you can. Buff your weapons with resins or bundles. You may not think it's worth it, but bundles in particular can definitely help in taking down an opponent. Also, some weapons, like for instance the Zwei, Lothric Knight Greatsword, Great Lance, usually heavier ultra weapons are going to be better when infused with heavy or sharp than raw, even at low soul levels. So I would recommend looking at the AR of the infusions either in-game or Soul Splinter. And speaking of, it'd be a great idea to pre-plan your build on Soul Splinter versus just starting right off the bat and just going into the fray.
Hallelujah! Thank you very much. It looks amazing.
And that covers pretty much everything with a raw build. Like I said in the beginning, this is the jack of all trades build. You have health, defense, decent damage with some burst damaging options and heavy hitters, ranged attacks, healing / regen, and you have tools to tackle almost any situation that presents itself to you in PvP. Should you be running this at higher soul levels like SL 72, 81, 90, meta, and up? Probably not. I tried that, and the raw gem damage will start to fall off hard, and even base stats start to increase the scaling damage past what raw can do. In any case, I think a raw build would probably work the best this way, in my opinion. But then again, this is just my way of making it. You can certainly tweak some things, but I hope that this brought some light on a rather interesting build that should have been explored earlier, but better late than never, I suppose. I hope this also gives you some motivation to try at least one more build into Dark Souls 3, as it's most likely going to be quiet once Elden Ring drops. Anyway, to briefly connect with y'all that stay around, the reason why I've been kinda absent is cause of some real life stuff. And it's all good, I promise you. Just 4 classes, 2 jobs, one of which is in my field of study, and an organization to run at my school. That's the quick explanation, but you know how life is. It just makes it difficult to find time to sit down and record. Even when Elden Ring drops, I'll still be as busy as ever, but just one more semester and I am free from these classes. But thank y'all for sticking around in these back streets of YouTube, and I hope you're doing well. Any criticisms or feedback is always appreciated, and I'll always be here. This has been Derpy. I'll see you guys later.
Gankers, standard line. Derpy, they outnumber us 3-1.
Then it is an even fight. All tryhards spam at will. Point down their mongrel hides.